Look, this first one, I think we've talked quite a lot about this, and I talked about it earlier. Read the journal, read the papers, get a sense for what the journal does and doesn't publish. Familiarise yourself with style, not just format, but style, the style of writing. I think that's particularly relevant for students and researchers that are looking to publish in a foreign language or a second language. Get a sense how to structure a paper for that journal, what works and what doesn't seem to work, etc. All that sort of thing is research you can do before you even send the paper off. Very much, what's the mission? We've talked a lot about this. If it's an analytical paper, if it's a paper that's too quantitative, too focused on modelling, then it's probably not appropriate for our journal, and we're quite specific about that and quite upfront about that. So I think we've talked quite a bit about that. Our editors like a cover letter. What should a cover letter contain? A cover letter should add something to the paper. It should make it easier for the editors to get a sense as to what this paper's about. Don't just fill it with a whole bunch of stuff. Make sure there's stuff in there that's relevant and that might even tip the scales in your favour in terms of taking this thing further, and something that's interesting. We've talked about transparency a lot. Replication is interesting in our field because a lot of our studies use data sets that replication, for example, is very common in economics because big data sets are being used and national data sets are being used and models are being developed by teams of researchers, and so findings, it's very important, or it's a common method to try and validate findings by replicating studies in different contexts, etc. In our field, it's quite difficult to do because a lot of the data that we gather is specific to our problem or specific to a context where we've been able to collect that data. I think what we're saying here is that don't expect it to be replicated, but do the research in such a way that it could be replicated. So in other words, all of the issues that we talked about with methods, with rigour, and with ethics sort of blend into that as well. And our last one, justify your choice of research design, which is kind of along the lines of what what Stephen was talking about, and also Christina, and make sure the research question fits the method. Make sure that if you're going down the path, for example, of a positivist research question or research paradigm, that you understand that a priori you're basically creating an expectation you're going to find something that you predict up front. So in order to go down that path, you need to be very certain about the relationships, and you also need to have a theory that, for example, might connect an independent and dependent variable in a study. So if you're vague about those things, not a good idea to be going down the path of a positivist research method if you can't create a very strong argument a priori for the fact that these relationships may or may not exist, and that the theory should provide a good explanation of that. I see this all the time with reviewing papers where there's kind of a vague set of relationships creating the context for a really specific set of hypotheses, and it's kind of, well, where did they come from? So that's kind of an important thing. Just one other that's not on the list. This is my perspective. Do research that you're passionate about. Don't do other people's research. I know, in different environments, in different academic environments, for example, I've seen people sometimes that have been under pressure to join a project because they have specific skills. My attitude to all that has always been that I'll only participate in a project if I really believe in it. I think the first group that Jim talked to said, do something, what was the word that you used? you have faith in it. I think that's what you were talking about, something you really believe in and something that you think is important. Do that sort of research as much as you possibly can, and you'll find that a lot of the other things will probably start to fit into place. If you're doing other people's research, or you're doing research because you think, oh, this is a sexy new topic that might get published, in my experience, that's not a good place to be. Do the stuff that you want to do. Okay. And don't. Before I start this is my don't worry. Okay? Don't worry. Things are never as bad or as good as they seem. That's my experience, particularly with academic publishing. Never don't get discouraged when you're asked to revise and resubmit a paper, or if you get. I've had students come to me and really dejected because they got a major revision. Everyone gets major revisions. In fact, I can't remember the last time I got a minor revision. The differentiation between the two is that a minor revision is maybe 2% of papers, and the other 98% are major revisions. So don't get dejected, and don't worry. So that's just my own personal input. Okay, the second one. Assume that writing and editing, don't assume that writing and editing doesn't matter. Get other people to read your papers. Read your papers yourself multiple times. Some people I know take this to almost an obsessive extent, where they'll read a paper maybe 20 times before they'll submit it. I've never done that. I'm not that interested in my own work, if that makes sense. I find it a lot easier to sort of distance myself more from what I do, but read what you've written and get others to give you feedback. One thing that I found out early in my career, or that I learnt, and really I learnt by doing, was that in academic publishing you're not writing a detective novel. You don't reveal everything in the last couple of pages. In academic writing you have to tell people in the introduction why this is a good piece of research, what contribution it makes, and how you did it. And you've got probably 2 pages to be able to convince reviewers that this looks like it could be really interesting. Then you take them on the journey to the final endpoint that you've already told them that you're going to go to. It's a little bit like going on a tour. You book a tour as a tourist to go to Delphi or somewhere like that, and they tell you up front, this is what we're going to do. That's a really important part of the front end of a paper, and the rest of the paper, you've got to actually make sure you deliver on that, and you actually take the person to that destination. As a reviewer, when you get papers like that, they're a joy to review, because everything just falls into place. So avoid, not in terms of the don't write detective novels, and don't surprise reviewers and people who are reading your research with things that jump out of the woodwork as you move through the paper. Be very sort of structured in that way.
And one thing Wendy wanted you to mention, should this point come up, is that if the language in which you're writing is not necessarily the native tongue, it would be very helpful to have someone whose first language is that language in order to proofread it. And one service that I've used that Mark actually recommended, and English is my native language, but it still was very beneficial for me, is a service called Scrivendi. Scrivendi or Scrivendi? You go online and we can't Google it here, you can Bing it, or whatever, search it, Alibaba, and find it somehow, it's called Scrivendi. You upload the manuscript, there's a certain lead time, and they have native English speaking proofreaders that'll read the manuscript and give you track changes. So that way when you submit it to international journals, everything is clear, there's no issue at all in terms of communication. It saves everybody a reject or resubmit or something like that. So Scrivendi, I'll find it and I'll distribute the links on WeChat or something.
And just the one last thing I'd say on that is, and this is why rereading is very good, and getting others to read the paper is a good idea, and getting feedback, is it's really important that your paper is internally consistent, that what you start out talking about and doing is what you end up doing, and that the path through the paper, that there's a clear line of logic through the paper that actually takes you to that end point. Sometimes, as Stephen said, it can be a really good idea to get people from outside your area to read a paper because even if they don't understand your particular area of expertise, they should be able to tell you whether they've been taken on that journey and it's clear and unambiguous. Sometimes when you're working on a paper for a long period of time, particularly with multiple authors, you can end up with the message kind of, it's clear here, and then it gets, there's a lot of noise in here, and there's a little bit of static there, and then all of a sudden something else happens at the end. So that's, All right, plagiarism, I think we've talked a lot about that. Don't do it. I can't really add much more to that. We will catch you. Don't suggest possible reviewers unless the journal asks you to. This one for me, I've always found this a problematic concept. For me as an author, when I've submitted a paper to a journal and they've asked me to suggest reviewers, I've always struggled with that as a concept. I know, there's arguments for and against. For our journal, we don't do that for JSCM. Some journals do, but personally, I've just struggled with that in terms of a whole range of issues. And to be quite honest, most times when I've submitted to a journal where that's been part of the process, the people I've suggested haven't been asked. So I've kind of wondered, well, what was the purpose of all this anyway? So, so I think this is related to what we just talked about. Make sure reviewers aren't reading the paper twice and then still wondering what this paper's really about. Make sure that the message is really clear and really unambiguous. And the last one, I guess we could say assume nothing. But don't assume that something was good enough in the past and it will suffice now. This is particularly relevant to our special issue at the start of this year where we talked about survey methods. That whole world now of doing survey research is evolving, where it's just becoming less and less acceptable to run the argument, for example, that you've used key informants in such a complex domain as, say, a supply chain where you're using polyadic constructs. It's really not practical for a single person to know everything about what's going on. So don't just read what was published 5 years ago, say, in JSCM in terms of survey research and assume that's going to be in 5 years' time acceptable. And that last, I think that citation from Armstrong and Overton is to do with not common methods bias, it's to do with non-response bias, yes. The other one, if you're doing survey research too, the other one that we highlight in the special issue is Podsakoff. When people citing Podsakoff and saying that, if you do this and you do that, that's enough to guard against common methods bias. If you actually read Podsakoff, he basically says, don't do this. This is kind of, you can't post hoc fix a bad research design by just running a test, a statistical test. There was a time when that was probably acceptable. Nowadays it probably isn't, and you can expect that these sorts of things will evolve over time. Okay, thank you.